Good morning and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our program titled Fractures Versus the Frustration of Federalism in Resolving Conflicts in Iraq. I'm Yerevan Saeed, a Bardani Scholar of Global Kurdish Studies here at the School of International Service at the American University. The vision of federalism adopted 2 decades ago to accommodate the needs and demands of Iraq's diverse ethnic and sectarian communities has failed to quell the country's long-standing political, economic, and territorial conflicts. Most notably, resource-sharing dispute between the Kurdistan Regional Government and the Iraqi government remain a persistent source of friction, highlighting the challenges of federal implementation in a deeply divided society. At the moment, a pervasive sense exists, not in Kurdistan or Iraq, but also in this town, in Washington, D.C., among think tankers, that those in power in Baghdad have hijacked the federal system for their own advantage, repackaging it as a new form of centralized rule, often to the detriment of Kurds and Sunnis in the country. This has been achieved through a web of legal, political, financial, and even military means. And the result, Iraq finds itself embroiled in familiar problems, reawakening the same long-standing grievances and issues of the past. The question remains, why has federalism failed to address these critical issues? What pathways are available to lead Iraq for a better future? And are the alternative to the current system? Having experimented monarchy, centralized governance, and now federalism, it's self-evident that the two prior systems have yielded only misery and destruction, not just for Iraq and its people, but also for its neighbors. To discuss the current status and state of federalism in Iraq and its future prospects, I'm honored to host Professor Dlawer Ala'Aldeen, the founding president of the Middle East Research Institute, or MERI, is a think tank based in Erbil, Kurdistan region. Professor Ala'Aldeen does not require an introduction, but I'm going to briefly mention or highlight his remarkable accomplishments. Between 2009 and 2012, he was the Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research in the Kurdistan Regional Government, where he led an ambitious reform program to modernize the higher education system in the Kurdistan region. Prior to that, he was a professor of medicine at Nottingham University, United Kingdom. He has been also engaged in capacity building and state building, and also he has extensively written about governance, about political dynamics and democratization in the Middle East, but particularly in Iraq and the Kurdistan region. He's the author of 2 books. His most recent book is Nation Building as a System of Self-Governance in the Kurdistan region. And his previous book was Lobbying for a Stateless Nation. I can tell you, Professor, that I was one of the earliest purchasers of your book when it came out some 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Some housekeeping rules before we get started. I'm happy to have a nearly 40 to 50-minute discussion with Dr. Ala'Aldeen, and then leave the rest of the session for Q&As from our audience. Please write your questions in the chat box. I'm going to read the questions later. Thank you. Doctor, thank you very, very much. And I really appreciate your time. I know it's like 6 p.m. in Erbil, so not quite convenient for you, but I'm really grateful for the time. I would like to ask you with a more broader question. I know that you wrote a paper about the deficiency in the structures of federalism and state building in Iraq. Can you give us an overview, of a bird-eye overview of the problems that exist with the current federal system in Iraq? The challenges, the risks, and the potential it faces.
Thank you, Yerevan, and thank your team and your university for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure. It is a complex subject, it's a tough one, but it's actually fairly straightforward as far as we are concerned. Obviously, Iraq is a complex country. Its diverse communities, its political dynamics, its history, its geography, all of that. So after the removal of Saddam, there was an opportunity to make life better, to rebuild Iraq and make it a constructive member of the international community and a player in the field or in the region, and be one of the best partners to the international partners who are interested in stability, growth, and economy. So 20 years ago, a roadmap was adopted in the name of the Constitution. It was put together in a rush because the circumstances at the time required that. Otherwise, we would have descended into even more chaos. And it was designed to be a transitional step, a simple roadmap for an intermediate future to put Iraq on a track of a good evolution and to be implemented in stages and to be amended, changed when necessary, when the time comes. The issue of federalism was debated from the outset, and the culture of constitutionalism as well as federalism never existed in Iraq. It was, I can't say invented, but it was superimposed on this social contract, and it was designed to be tailor-made for Iraq, not necessarily a copy of other countries, although it was. In many ways, you can see how much we extrapolated from Lebanon and from America on it. But despite its flaws and problems, it was still considered to be a good enough starting point. 20 years later, we look back, many people think that federalism failed in Iraq. But in reality, it never started. You can't have something failing when you've not given it a good go, a good experiment. You've not even piloted it. Iraq was always run as a unitary, as a single state, highly, highly centralized, at least since the monarchy, since the removal of the monarchy. So Iraq was never a federal entity or country. And the federalism that was developed in 2005 by the committee of elected people, mostly consisting of Kurds and Shias with voting rights during the writing of the constitution, but not with many Sunnis with that same right. It was written for a country that can become federal, but it was not federal. And then when you look back, you will find that the only part that likes to call itself federal in the mindset of the politicians and people is the Kurdistan part. The rest of Iraq, no one, including the ruling elite, as well as the opposition and the ordinary people, they don't think federal. They think as one country and increasingly centralized. Whereas Kurdistan always likes to emphasize the word federal because at the time of writing the constitution, Kurdistan was fairly independent. They felt as though they need to be re-annexed to Iraq, to the rest of Iraq. And that annexation was called federalization. But even in the eye of the Kurds, that's generally, as well as Kurdish politicians, they never really deeply understood what federalism should mean in Iraq. They knew what federalism was about in Europe, places like Germany, or in America. But want to be tailor-made in Iraq, nobody had a clear view or vision. But in the Kurdish mindset, federalism meant to be almost independent, but still be part of Iraq. But this is not what the constitution said. So the Kurdistan region exercised powers and rights that were far above and beyond what the constitution provided. Conversely, Baghdad never wanted federalism. They saw the Kurdish model not a good idea because they thought so much independence and so much tendencies of being economically and politically independent would be a risk to Iraq. Say if Basra and Bar and others wanted to do exactly the same, to have exactly the same model as Kurdistan, that is too many independent entities within an Iraq that is already weakened in Baghdad. So everybody saw that the Kurdish model is a threat to Iraq, so they did everything they could to prevent further federalization of the other provinces in Iraq. The Sunnis too, they were always nostalgic about one Iraq led by the Sunni group, and they never overtly asked for federalism at the time of the constitution. And the Shias, now they got power, secured their majority. Why would they want to do that? So with that Kurdistan model in mind, everybody rushed into preventing further federalization. In the process, Baghdad became more and more centralized and with centralization tendencies, especially with one ethnic component consolidating its power with no intention of relinquishing or diluting or delegating or devolving power from Baghdad. Now, a lot of things happened in terms of legislations and reorganization, but they were not with the mindset, with the idea of implementing the constitution as it was written and intended. No, it was more like adjusting to the new Iraq and making sure that the whole of Iraq is functional as a centralized place, but bringing Kurdistan back into Iraq as a federal entity. That is actually the way things evolved, and where we say we failed, collectively that is, we're not singling out Baghdad or anyone, collectively, in that this social contract, this constitution, was kept as it was. So many fundamental institutions, critical components, which should have been developed, established, and empowered very early on, were never established. There are, at least from the review that we did recently, we found at least 33 articles in a constitution that is only about 150 or so articles. That means at least 1/5 of it is still not enacted because there are legislations pending. In terms of keeping the federal structure institutionalized and better established, you need the upper chamber to prevent the lower chamber from completely monopolizing power and taking Iraq to a direction that is more populistically driven. This upper chamber was never established, and there is still no law in the parliament to debate that. And this is actually a fundamental failure where it made both Kurdistan and Baghdad completely unhappy about each other. They stopped trusting each other. They stopped solving problems and solving crises. Too many issues outstanding are not dealt with, and the parliament continues to bypass the executive as well as the judiciary through being the ultimate power source. The federal court was never established as per the constitution. The oil and gas law was never introduced. The various commissions that were supposed to be overseeing, auditing, and regulating the management of assets and the country as a whole were never implemented, and many other legislations that were designed to be complementing the state building process, some of which even were legislated for, were never implemented because of politics. but also selective in what they wanted to implement in the constitution, and they were selective in their interpretation of various articles. And Baghdad was all along accused of being selective in what they want to choose from the constitution. And of course, all this led to Kurdistan wanting to part ways with Iraq. And ever since, Iraq's approach or Iraq's policies, it's not a secret that Iraq wanted to reduce Kurdistan's federal entity or powers to below the constitution at best for them, or up to the constitution at worst for them. Whereas Kurdistan tries at best to maintain the tradition, the long tradition of being relatively independent at best, or at worst to be living up to the constitution as it is. So now we are at a juncture where amending the constitution, it's not easy or possible. Just forget that. It's just not going to happen. But importantly, why would you change something that you've not even tried yet? 20 years after, almost 20 years, 20 years after the removal of Saddam and 18 years of the constitution, no one can actually say with a hand on heart saying, we tried the constitution and it has flaws and problems, let's amend it. The answer is no. What you had was the best that you could have had, and you did not give it a go. Now we have a fragile state growing increasingly fragile, a state that should have its normality, its stability, its economic power, yet it's growing increasingly vulnerable. The state institutions are still weak and getting weaker, with non-state actors overwhelming the state, whether that is armed non-state actors within the state.
Okay, looks like we lost Professor. Professor, we lost you for a moment. Probably the internet is not helping.
This is life in Kurdistan at the moment, or Iraq. So maybe to end the introduction by saying that we have a very vulnerable, fragile state, as well as a very vulnerable, fragile region in Kurdistan. So Baghdad and Kurdistan both are suffering from lack of functionality as entities that are state entities. And in Baghdad, the original understanding between the three major components was that there should be balance of power with enough right to other minorities. Yet the presidency that was meant to be a guarantee for good laws coming out, for keeping an eye on the state building process and protecting the constitution, now the president is rendered virtually powerless and virtually ceremonial. The only function they have is to appoint the prime minister. The rest of the time, the parliament and the government actually can ignore the president. That's where the Kurds see that their power being undermined increasingly. Of course, the Kurds are also not united in Baghdad, undermining themselves too, but that's by the by, because we're talking about the state building process. And the Sunnis are also increasingly vulnerable. You saw how a court that has been used, or at least been accused for being used by the Shia majority, that they managed to get rid of the Speaker of the Parliament for good or bad reason, it doesn't matter, but they remain vulnerable and no guarantees for maintaining their share of power. So back with Iraq being undermined by non-state actors, by lack of will to implement the constitution, by lack of will to fill the gaps, the structural and functional gaps in the state constitution. This is actually where not just federalism, but also relation between Baghdad and Basra are failing. And Baghdad and all the periphery and the other provinces are failing. And people's trust in that constitution, in the future, in the political process are also failing. So let alone for Kurdistan being happy in Baghdad. So every actor you name, including the Kurdish actors, have not done enough to make their own homework and Baghdad work. Neither Baghdad embraced everybody, including Kurdistan, nor everybody, including Kurdistan, went to own the power or decision-making process in Baghdad. That, over and above that, we've got all the regional dimensions to power struggle in Iraq and global dimension too. So I'm going to stop here and let you decipher any area that you might like to elaborate on.
Yeah, thank you. That was really an insightful overview of what is happening in the country. So what is interesting about this paradox is between, where the center of power are. When it's in Erbil, they're trying to obviously, overstep their constitutional probably, powers and trying to make the best out of, whatever is in the constitution and the federal system, and use it to empower and consolidate power, power in the Kurdistan region. On the other hand, now you have Baghdad, which is more like, a resurgent Baghdad is more powerful, and the Kurdistan is really embroiling in political, economic, and even social, upheavals, maybe, or a crisis. So you have these two, dynamics. So the implementation of the constitution really depends on who is in power, and those who are in power obviously violate and they use it and tilt it toward their own advantage. What is the solution in your view for this dilemma?
Well, basically the power is not in one place in Iraq, and you cannot have a face-to-face negotiation with a small group of policymakers and you think that's it, it's sorted. Even as a state institutions, Iraq, with its weaknesses, is too divided and fragmented, but also politically too. And the divisions and the fragmentations used to be vertical, Arab, Sunni, Shia, and so on. But now within each component, the fragmentation is horizontal as well as vertical. So that actually trickles all the way down to minorities, even as small groups as religious and ethnic minorities. They are too, not only divided, but also increasingly polarized and militarized. So when it comes to implementation of anything or developing the will to change anything, you have to work within the system, bottom up. You have to work with all the different sub-state actors as well as non-state actors to create the political will to change the system in small baby steps, bottom up, in phases. Even then, very few people are optimistic that it can be fixed. You mentioned that Baghdad now is strong. This is not the word people use. Baghdad is now stable, but not strong. Baghdad stabilized after a good majority winning faction withdrew from the parliament and government. And of course, it represents a broad coalition where lots of compromises had to be made to keep this government stable. And many believe that Iraq reached a bottom, that the only way forward from here is up. That's why everybody started supporting this government, giving it the benefit of the doubt and helping it focus on some of the urgent priorities. But you can see from security crisis and other behaviors, every now and then you realize that actually the state is still not capable of delivering on everything that the government had, including the program. I mean, you're talking about the state being undermined from within. You will also see that there is a huge budget that was endorsed in Baghdad last year after a very protracted process, the barriers for implementation are so huge that to date we have not seen major progress. And it's not because the government is not willing or the government is weak. It's just that this is the complexity of the dynamics. And Erbil-Baghdad relationship is actually back to some stability and with very good engagement between the two. Nonetheless, salaries are still not paid, and the oil issue is still not resolved, and the two sides are still not happy. So basically, we are at the moment entering a phase of pre-election phase, whether it's a general election in 25 or 26, but we will be entering that. Until then, we may find the stability lasting or this kind of normality, but you cannot guarantee that beyond that, things will not go backwards. I'm not trying to be pessimistic about this, but the way forward is to actually help evolution by design rather than leaving it to nature. The international community need to engage the Iraqi forces, the Iraqi actors in Baghdad, in Erbil, in other places, in the right way to help Iraq evolve in the right way. And they should be supporting the policymakers within the state to strengthen the state institutions, work on these institutions to have visions and clarity and the skills and the capacity. So essentially, if you are in a hurry with raised bar of raised expectations of miracles happening in Iraq in the next year or two, you will always be frustrated and disappointed, and it will never happen. But if you look at what we went through in Iraq in the last 50 years, you need to adopt a longer term view of how you can make this country work from within at sub-state level, at the state level, and then in the region, because we are very much hostages of regional power dynamics, as well as global. No one character and no one power can actually promise you anything and drive the evolution and make Iraq work again. Iraq's fragility and dysfunctionality requires a whole new approach from all actors. And at the moment, not all actors agree that Iraq should be fixed. Even internally, if you just look at the way corruption is driving the evolution, you will conclude that it's going to be a tough challenge even inside to drive the evolution by the main actors who are now governing, let alone by regional rivalries that are also dictating the agenda. But there are ways of, as I mentioned, bottom up, working on the state institutions and working with the state decision makers and having a good engagement and creating a good environment for that healthy evolution.
Okay, thank you. And something that you mentioned briefly in your introduction about the role of judiciary, and some people probably disagree with you about, like, Parliament to be the arbitrator of laws and probably the most powerful. But now some believe that the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, has been weaponized by those who are in power against other, against especially Sunnis and the Kurds in the country. If you look at the past 2 years, you can see a series of decisions or verdicts, issued by the Supreme Court against the Kurdistan regional government, when it comes to oil exportation, for example. The Sunni speaker was probably, justifiably was removed because of, what he had done with his, members of his party. But still, there is this conviction about weaponization of the Supreme Court. How do you analyze this new dynamic that has been injected into the federal system in the country? Because the federal court was not that active, for example, 5 years ago. Now it has been activated in a very unprecedented way.
I think the weaponization of the court, anybody who knows Iraq and observes events would not disagree that the court has been weaponized, not today, but from the outset. But never the court has been so powerful as today, very often overstepping its mark and engaging in activities or decisions that are purely executive or even legislative. But at the moment, this is the best you have, because in the absence of this court, there is no other. The Iraqi leaders have failed to agree on implementing the relevant article that requires establishing a federal court as per the Constitution. So the court that we have, the federal court we have, is actually not federal, but it is dealing with the federal, but it's actually going back to a law that was a decision rather than law, decision made by Ayad Alawi's government in 2005, even before the Constitution was ratified. And this is the law that has been the basis, the foundation of forming this court that is by no means meeting the expectation of the Constitution. And of course, with the majority being, everyone is appointed through political or ethnic or religious affiliations, and they are part of the society that individuals are influenced by their surrounding and by the political and religious affiliations, or at least environment. So the court is what it is, and it is subject to all sorts of manipulation. I don't think many people doubt that. But in the absence of this court, you have a weakened president of Iraq that cannot block or reject any legislation, or cannot interpret or to do anything to do with whatever comes out of the parliament. You have a parliament that is now at least dominated, and overwhelmingly so, by a group that were actually electoral losers, i.e. those who lost the election. And they are, even before this term, the previous parliaments, the Council of Representatives, again, the majority were able to undermine the authority of the president by preventing any blockage of any law, that even if the president disagreed and did not wish to sign that legislation before it's enacted or published in Al-Waqa'i al-Iraqiyya, they bypassed all of those steps that are traditions or legal or constitutional. So the parliament got away with bypassing the president completely and failed or refused to create the upper chamber that would filter its own laws. That tells you that federalism will not go forward in the absence of these critical state structures. The court has to be trusted and win the faith of all the people who are affected by it. The parliament has to be thinking state building all the time and legislating to complement the Constitution and enacting all of those laws. The presidency has to be tackled through a new law, and that's not difficult, empowering the president to fulfill his functions or her functions, i.e. the presidency needs to fulfill its functions. At the moment cannot, neither as part of the governing executive body, which the Constitution says it is, nor as the guarantor for constitutional integrity. That means in the absence of the upper chamber, which is the Federal Council, having a weakened presidency and having no credible court, you cannot actually progress with federalism, because whatever case you bring for, i.e. whatever case you make to the court, you cannot trust the ultimate decision will be respected by everyone, or everybody would accept this to be a just and final decision. And by the way, any judgment or any ruling by this court is not subject to any appeal. Therefore, anything they say or do is final. So with federalism is an engagement between all the different entities or characters or bodies or institutions in the country, when they are not signed up to or committed to this spirit, and in the absence of the spirit of constitutionalism, respect to this new culture, you will not find things progressing. For example, this government of Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, and which is part of Itilaf al-Dawla, which is the coalition of the state coalition, all the parties in it signed up to the same pledge or manifesto saying that they will issue a list of laws that would eradicate or get rid of any problem they had, whether with Erbil or with the provinces. And they would do their best to at least draft and legislate for the fundamental issues to get rid of those crises from the roots rather than just manage them. And to date now, well over 14 months later, we are not seeing any of those progressing. You cannot blame the Prime Minister on this. You have to really face the entire state coalition group, i.e. the entire body that committed itself to honor these pledges. And in the absence of that, we will see the fragility continuing, federalism not progressing, state building going backwards, and then we're suspending our problems for a long time to come.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned two, very important elements of, federalism, the upper, chamber of the House that has not been enacted, even though it should have been. And also the second thing you mentioned is the role of the presidency. I think up to 2008, we had something called the Presidency Council, the two vice presidents, the president, they had the power to veto any law that they deemed unconstitutional or not serving the broad interests of Sunni Shias and the Kurds. But after 2008, that is gone, and constitutionally, many argue that the president is just a ceremonial role. It has no any power to veto. Even if it does, after 10 days, the bill becomes law, regardless whether the president acted or not. Do you think it might be possible, or there is any support for any kind of law that empowers the president to, for example, veto or to return the law to the parliament?
The solution was meant to be that after the first term of parliament until 2008, when the Presidential Council, which meant the president and his deputies, they had to be unanimously accepting or rejecting any law, they were effectively replacing the function of the upper chamber, the Federal Council, in the absence of it. The idea was to give themselves 4 years during which they would create the upper chamber and reduce the Presidential Council to the president. So it would not have mattered if the presidency was weakened or not, if the upper chamber had been there. The idea was to have the chamber within 4 years, and never happened. What people say that the majority Shia powers or forces, the ones who are now effectively owning the executive branch, which is the Prime Minister, is always going to be a Shia, they are not in a hurry. They don't see any reason for them to rush into weakening their own parliament, where they are actually able to legislate, even if it's poor legislations. So when the first 4 years passed by without the legislation for the upper chamber, yet at the same time they got rid of the Presidential Council and weakened the president, this period, until we have the Federal Council created, however many decades to come, we will always be in this limbo where the president role is weakened. But it's not just that. The president's role is weakened also deliberately in other ways. For example, the Constitution says the president is in charge of any ceremonial occasion of the armed forces, like the 6th of January, which is the commemoration of the military display. Yet, time and time again, look at Mustafa Kadhim's days, look at Abadi's days, They always went and not allowing the president to go, which the constitution says at least give him that. The prime minister is the commander-in-chief. That should be enough. Give the ceremony to the president, yet they wanted to appear on television themselves. When the parliament legislated a very, very bad law on higher education a few years ago, and the president refused to sign it, the parliamentarians, the committee, threatened the president by saying, if you do not sign it, we will legislate so that you'll have no power of ratifying, or at least it should not be needed. In fact, there was a time when they decided that all you need to do with the president is to wait 15 days and any legislation would pass. Whether it was deliberate or not, every draft legislation these days that are submitted to the parliament for debate, at the end of that draft, they write on it that this law is enacted the day that it's voted for in the parliament. This is illegal. This is not constitutional. It should be enacted and ratified only when the president signs it and only when it's published in Al-Waqaya Al-Iraqiyya. Yet, they undermine the president's role by writing this, even while the legislation is a draft, it's being debated. They write that statement. And when they submit it to the president, they write that in bold. They say, this is a law, whether you sign it or not. And when the president at some point decided that the only leverage they have left is to prevent its publication in Al-Waqaya Al-Iraqiyya, then the parliamentarians threatened. They said, this is a law we wanted. It's going to be interesting and important for our own personal interest. If you do not allow this, we will legislate and amend any legislation that says you must publish, and we get rid of this necessity for it to be published by you. So every time they made sure that the president is alone, is isolated, is under threat, and therefore his powers are undermined. And they do that with every other institution they like. The parliament is capable of doing that because at the end of the day, it's the parliament that legislates for everyone.
Thank you. That's very interesting details. Probably not many people have heard about in the past, including myself. In fact, about how the MPs are writing on these drafts, and they say that it becomes a law when it's passed or voted in the parliament. So who is responsible for all of these problems? Why the Sunni MPs or the Kurdish MPs do not raise these questions? Why they are not making a fuss about all of this? And what is a remedy for these problems that exist?
You cannot blame any one side or any one party or any one person. It's collective. It's a collective failure, and without exception. And of course, Kurdish, Sunni, and other MPs, they raise these issues. They all know about it, and they still do it because they still not raised this to the awareness, or at least they've not created the sense of urgency within the decision makers to actually give these things priority, including the upper chamber, including the president's powers. Imagine the president, the various presidents we've had, they themselves have not proposed legislation, submitted it to the parliament, lobbied for it so that they are empowered themselves. I.e., at least the president should be going out fired up to legislate for their own positions' empowerment, at least for their own sake. But if they don't do that, nobody will do it on their behalf. And of course, the Kurds, who are, in a way, they see themselves as the victims of this, they're not united enough to push for any legislation that would guarantee Kurdistan's protection. They need to be first united, then have a vision, then have a program, then have a whole team of fired up MPs and lawyers and advocates, and then engage the Sunnis and the Shias and the like-minded people to say, this is what is good for Iraq. They are not doing that. And conversely, for the Shias, those who are in charge, those who are drivers of evolution there, they see not in their interest to do that, because you're talking about checks and balances that prevent them from actually taking Iraq as a whole. They are not blamed for looking after their interests and not doing it. The blame is on everybody else who need it and not lobby for it. The Sunnis, for example, at the moment they are so divided, they are so busy internally fighting over positions, they are in no way trying to build a state so that they are protected through the checks and balances. I'm not saying this is a forever permanent situation and it'll be doom and gloom, but to evolve the system, to fix it, it's not an overnight thing. It has to be, again, through a process. This process has not started.
Okay, thank you. Before I go to my next question, I just want to remind our audience that, they can write their question in the Q&A boxes, and I'll make sure to read the question. We already have one question, but let's talk about Kurdistan, Baghdad relationship. And it has been the historical unfortunate, like when Baghdad is in chaos, Kurdistan thrives. And in my view, that shouldn't be the case. I think Baghdad and Kurdistan can rise together. They can, thrive together. What is the best framework to reorganize Kurdistan-Baghdad relationship in which everyone would be at least satisfied, and the rights of the Kurdistan, especially when it comes to natural resources, budget, finance, and extra, to be respected within this new framework?
I think there is a solution, and that is the constitution. But in the past, I mentioned that both sides have been not in a rush and being selective in what they want. Just an example, the stickiest issue between Baghdad and Erbil has been, and will always be, oil and gas revenue. This is straightforward if you want to legislate for it. But if you don't, it's the articles are subject to interpretation, and everybody goes about interpreting their own way. There are 3 articles, call them 110, 111, 112. Everybody's happy about 111. No discussion, because it says oil and gas belong to everybody. That's fine. Now, the Kurdish side insists on one of them. They love Article, say, 110. No, the Iraqis love 110, and the Kurds love 112. Why? Because one of them says Iraq has the full authority, an exclusive authority over all these assets, whereas the other one says regional and new developments can be done together. So imagine the Kurdish side never wanted the former article, I think 110, and Baghdad never wanted 112. And if you take the Kurdish side completely out of the equation, you find that Iraq, Baghdad, never wants that law implemented, because it clearly says or empowers provinces, even the ones that are not regions, like in Basra. They would have so much control over whatever they dig out that Baghdad will lose its control centrally. Baghdad being increasingly centralizing, they would find themselves, their powers diluted. So no oil minister in Baghdad wants to legislate and find their own powers diluted, not by Kurdistan, but by all the other provinces that are oil producing. So essentially, the constitution was written in that way for a reason, and that's for it to be implemented. But Kurdistan in particular always had this problem with the rest of Iraq. The past has been really overwhelmingly dark and nightmare, the way that Baghdad treated Kurdistan under Saddam and everyone in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, they always ask the question, what has changed in the mindset of Baghdad for us to then give up so much that we've earned over the years? That's power, that's income, that's everything. Therefore, in the absence of institutionalization of the relationship between Erbil and Baghdad, in the absence of checks and balances of rule of law, in the absence of all those institutions we talked about, there's no way Erbil would go and open all its books and put its future and always forget about future independence. It will not happen. But if Baghdad wants that happen, they have to start from Baghdad before they start blaming Erbil. They have to get Baghdad functional, get it into full functionality, its checks and balances, state institutions, and then begin to blame or request better integration of Kurdistan. And in the same way, look at the southern part of Iraq, with a country that is as rich as Iraq, and its resources managed in the way it has done, with the population growing by more than 1 million these days every year, people think that in less than 20 years, we will be 70 million. So the problems that are state functionality problems, the problems that are out there, outside the state and inside the state's fragility, will always be exaggerated. But a fragile state, its own institutional fragility can produce crises that become worsened by political dynamics. And conversely, politics are producing crises that make the state even more fragile and dysfunctional. Exactly what we are seeing in Baghdad and Erbil, both between them and within them. Like, look at Kurdistan's internal problems. They're highly political, but in the fragility of the region's institutions, they became overwhelming. And conversely, Kurdistan's state fragility or institutional fragility are creating problems that the politicians don't know how to manage, and that make the crisis worse. And in Baghdad, you have to multiply that by 100. Baghdad's resources, Baghdad's dynamics are more complex. Baghdad's struggle and rivalry for power, as well as its international dimension, are far worse. So whatever you say on a micro level in Kurdistan, Baghdad is 10 times or 100 times more. Baghdad-Erbil relationship, it's actually not difficult to deal with if they engage in confidence-building measures through legislations, through codifying the relationship, through actually doing enough practically to earn each other's trust. Currently, they are not busy doing that, neither on the economy and oil and gas, nor on security and armed forces in disputed territories, nor in sharing power in Baghdad. Of course, above all, is the state-building process. They should all be sharing it together, doing it. And when, in the absence of all of that, we are not seeing progress here. There may be cosmetic managements, like, for example, the government of Mohammed Shia Sudani and the government of Mustafa al-Kadhimi. They are really good friends, and they were very good friends with the Kurds. So the Kurds don't complain about the government, but their complaint is all about the constitution and the whole of Iraq. So what have we done here? Over to you.
Right. Thank you. And so you mentioned about the hydrocarbon law that has been sitting since 2007 in the Iraqi parliament. The current government of Prime Minister, Sudani promised that it would be enacted within 6 months. That was very ambitious, and now we are 14 months into the government, and there's no any sign that this would be legislated. What is holding back this legislation? And also, what is going to happen to the oil operators in the Kurdistan region in the term of oil payment, because that's a sticky issue between Erbil and Baghdad, and it has led to almost complete shutdown of the oil sector in the Kurdistan region in the term of exportation.
Well, complex questions, but let's try and think of simple answers. I mentioned the oil and gas dispute, and it's not going to be so easily, so readily solved, because the intention in the Iraqi government is not there deep enough. So this promise of 6 months, was predicted to be a difficult one to keep. given the dynamics, given the culture and mindset. In terms of the oil issue between Baghdad and Erbil, this has been brewing from the day that Kurdistan started digging oil 10 years ago or exporting, and it started when Baghdad-Erbil political relationships started declining. So Kurdistan, for a good number of years, managed to dig oil, transport it and export it, and get the revenue back without Baghdad having a big say because of Turkish cooperation. And Baghdad, they tolerated that. They had enough oil going out, they had enough income from themselves, and they refused to pay salaries. So one was doing against the other. It was a matter of time before it was going to blow out of proportion, because Iraq was determined to sue Turkey on allowing Kurdish oil to be exported and revenue coming back to Kurdistan. So after what happened in Paris, and after Turkey accepted that this ruling is something that should be taken seriously, negotiations managed to lead to a good point, especially with the Sudani government being flexible, in that ultimately Turkey is now ready to allow oil to be exported and sold. Baghdad was the problem, and now Baghdad government says we're actually happy to allow this to continue in Kurdistan too. But the latest problem, which is that the Iraqi's budget law does not allow Baghdad, which is now the main negotiator or the ultimate source. In the future, the oil companies need to negotiate prices with Baghdad, not Erbil anymore. They have contracts with Erbil where they have to recover the cost of their drilling and exploitation, which comes to up more than $20 per barrel, whereas Baghdad's budget law, this government's budget law, dictates that that companies should not be given any more than $8. And this clause was not introduced by the Iraqi government in the budget law, but by the committee, the parliamentary committee, that they superimposed that. Now, until they change that in the parliament, apparently you cannot have oil flowing even if Baghdad, Erbil, and Ankara agree to that. But remember, in Baghdad, it's not just the government or the prime minister. The forces that have a say in the whole of this oil crisis, the intention is to squeeze Kurdistan for as long as they can and use that leverage to reduce the federal entity and its powers down to the level that they need. Because after all, if you want to squeeze any component, especially Kurdistan region, it has to be done through income, through funds, through money, because that's where power is. So when you want Kurdistan to comply with Baghdad and have reduced power and make them, or at least undermine their authority, you have to do it through oil and gas. And for as long as that leverage is there, many centralized mindsets, or many politicians especially in the Shia actors, they believe that this leverage should not be released or relaxed until they gain more on Kurdish independence tendencies or Kurdish integration with Baghdad. But they are overdoing it at the expense of the people of Kurdistan, who are waiting for this revenue so that their basic needs are covered. So this length of time, with lack of funding, with the poor management of funds, has now taken so long that it will be counterproductive in the mind of the Kurds, who will never see Iraq as their country if even this government under this constitution cannot actually rescue their poverty, rescue them from poverty, and begin to bring life to normality. So it is actually going to be counterproductive. Whereas the Kurdish side, they have been time and time again over the last year or two, have been conceding and going back to Baghdad, trying to compromise, and they always come back disappointed. So we are now on the verge of actually an agreement. We predict that early in the next year, the parliament will have no excuse but to amend that budget law, and the international communities should be ready to export. And this will open a door that Kurdish oil, when it goes out, then there will be no excuse not to pay salaries in full and have the budget fully implemented.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I would like to ask, the last question, then I'll go to our audience about, potential alternative for the current system. I understand that you said, federalism has not been tried, so we cannot say whether it has failed or succeeded. So are you still with, with the fact that federalism should be tried and implemented in its full force so that we'll understand what is going to happen in the future, or you have something else as an alternative for the current framework that brings everyone together, at least?
Well, from the outset, some 20 years ago, many people believed that what Kurdistan had was short of a state. And what can save Iraq as an integral one body is not to have Kurdistan agreeing to give up powers and their ability to make their own decisions and ability to cater for their own cultural, economic, as well as developmental needs. People thought that you cannot have any model transplanted in Kurdistan and call it federal, and then nothing that of Baghdad-Arbi relation looked like a federal relationship. And time showed that the best model would have been to save Iraq by calling Kurdistan, only Kurdistan, a confederal model. The Kurds would have been more than satisfied with that. The Kurds would have been able to protect themselves and have no reason to leave Iraq, because Iraq is an important stage, an important business opportunity, important country to have backing you. The Kurds would have had no excuse to go for anything other than confederalism. So if you define anything to do with the relative sovereignty that the Kurds enjoyed, a confederal model would have fit best. And now the Kurdish mindset, the Kurds as people as well as leaders, they are really, really struggling to live with the idea of giving up what they have already. And what they have already is not federal definition, it's a confederal one. Look at the international relations and foreign relations that the Kurds have and maintain. Look at the way that they're engaging the entire world, the way you engage Baghdad. Even Baghdad, ordinary people and politicians, when they talk about Kurdistan, they as if it's a different country. But Kurdish commitment to Iraq would be probably better enhanced if Iraq, in a way, reassures the Kurds that you keep what you have now, but stay within Iraq. And that is confederalism. Even in 2017 would have been much, much more practical for Iraq to say, keep what you have, but be Iraqi forever. That would have worked. And no two Kurds would have disagreed into signing up to the new Iraq with that condition in mind. Because in 2017, remember, all the disputed territories that the Kurds were always dreaming about, the bulk of it were actually under Kurdish control, even though much of it, like 1/3 of it, was under Iraqi control, but the Kurds were quite happy to say that is Iraqi forever. It would have solved the Article 140. So what is in reality, what that is not discussed, that people do not actually want to overtly talk about in Baghdad, they do not dare to talk about formally. To you and I, it's actually an obvious thing. If you want to keep Kurdistan inside Iraq forever, you need to protect what they have now forever. And the Kurds would have no excuse to leaving Iraq. But this is something that needs a transformational thinking in Baghdad before in Erbil. Otherwise, the independence tendencies for the Kurds will always be there, and they are not blamed for that.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to our first question from an anonymous attendee. Here's a question. Do you believe that the current KRG delegation to Baghdad has the ability to safeguard the Kurdistan region's constitutional rights, including its financial entitlement and share of the federal budget. So far, we have not observed any significant progress.
This is a very Kurdish question, by the way. I'm not going to ask you who asked it, but by inference, they are implying that the answer is no. So I'm not going to comment on this, but remember, we are in Kurdistan, we're still building capacity, building our expertise and learning from mistakes, and these situations are very new. So you try to make the most of or the best of what you have. In my opinion, I've always said to whoever I could talk to in terms of the leaders, I always think that the big guns need to lead discussions. We are in no position to doubt the capacity of the individuals who go to Baghdad, but remember, they are technocrats, they are civil servants, and they need empowering. The best way of dealing with Baghdad is to go to Baghdad, and we need the big guns to go in large numbers and in frequencies that are needed to win arguments, in establishing good relations and having face-to-face discussions. The way that Kurdistan is dealing with this negotiation is not going to work, because it's not just the nature of the committees and the negotiation skills that they have. It's to do with the Kurdistan not really putting enough emphasis on really negotiating it more effectively in Baghdad. I think we need to encourage the Kurdistan leaders, whether they are politicians or government or even parliament, and when they exist, they need to be more engaging in Iraq. And negotiations should not be unidimensional, because the teams that go to Baghdad, they are more like technical team. They are able to take numbers and which tax is Baghdad, which tax is federal, whatever. Whereas the failure or success of the entire exercise is political. So my own view is that until the politicians go more often and with more rigor and better prepared and doing more homework, it's not going to be an ad hoc occasional trip that very rarely they even stay overnight to dine with them, to know them better, let alone to actually win their hearts. Lobbying is all about making more friends and reducing enemies and winning hearts as well as minds. I'm being self-critical about the KRG, but that's the reality. You cannot blame Baghdad that its intention to centralize power and squeeze Kurdistan more and more. Well, it's the Kurdish side that needs to be cleverer than that.
Thank you. I like what you used, the big guns. It's also has been my observation that we're not making use of, our, politicians who have over 30, 40 years of, dealing with Baghdad and have been in politics for quite a long time. I don't know, they're just sitting in Suleimania and Erbil and elsewhere. Unfortunately, even though they're not in the position and power, but they have, the charisma, they have the relationship, they can influence decision making, as you rightfully, as you correctly point out, it's all political.
Yeah. And also, it's obvious that we need unity. We need not just unity in terms of political discourse, but also in having a joint roadmap. When you go to Baghdad, you have to have one view, even if it's diverse negotiators. Anyway, over to you.
Okay, my second question from Binav Al-Nu'man. And here is a question: how the presence of non-state actors can complicate the implementation of Article 140 in the disputed territories between Baghdad and Erbil? That's, the first question. And the second question he has is, does the federal Supreme Court try to centralize the government or centralize power, obviously, in the country?
So the first question was non-state actors, are they complicating Article 140's implementation? Is that what it is?
Right, yes.
Well, the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, Article 140's implementation was a difficult one, if not an impossible one to begin with. When everybody had all the right intentions at the time when the Constitution was written. Now we have a whole new dynamics. Non-state actors, and they are diverse, they are now increasingly institutionalized and well established in all disputed territories. They are engaged in local economy, local politics, local elections, local anything to do with power. And even the dark economy is growing and increasingly, overwhelmingly institutionalized, and non-state actors clearly are enjoying the buffer zone, the void, the vacuum between Iraq state and Kurdistan. And while both Baghdad and Erbil are unable to deal with that, it's the non-state actors who are increasingly powerful there, and they are able to block any solution that both Baghdad and Erbil have put forward. And Sinjar agreement is a very, very obvious example, where there are agreements between Baghdad and Erbil, everybody wants it, and prime ministers have been insisting on it and having real intention with programs, with practical steps to implement them. Yet the reason why it's not progressing is because of non-state actors in the area. And by the way, when we often talk about non-state actors in Baghdad, it's not a secret that they are the state these days, because the state has to take them into serious account, or have to take them really seriously before making any step to do anything, whether in disputed territories or elsewhere. So this is not like a transient, exceptional circumstance. Now, Article 140, the way it was impossible, is now becoming even more, but the Kurdish worry is more than that. Well, it's not just Kurdish worry, everybody's worry. First of all, this lack of stability and normalization are making us in Iraq lose more and more minorities, ethnic and religious, including Christians and Yazidis, by the numbers that are, it's now unstoppable, the way they migrate onwards to Europe. In some ways, some of the minorities lost the critical mass that would sustain them as viable communities. And the Christians in Iraq, not in Kurdistan region, but in Nenab plain, may reach that level of critical mass, below critical mass, that they cannot sustain themselves. They will be in displacement abroad and migrating, so on. So that's one thing. The other is the act of Arabization are scaring people. Now, in Kirkuk, this has been going on since the referendum, and this has been going on in Nineveh, and it's not stoppable. It's if you talk to anyone, they would not admit that this is Arabization, but it is displacing populations and replacing them with loyal groups and whatever you might call that. That will make normalization, stabilization, and solving Article 140 completely not only impossible, but the thing of the past. When new settlers come and settle in an area, they become permanently fixed. Look at America and the way that the natives lost land. Look at Israel. Look at any country. So basically, once you Arabize a place that is Christian or Kurdish, with time, it becomes even constitutionally wrong, or human rights would not allow you to penalize generations in the future. So the answer is really, in a nutshell, yes.
Okay, and the second question, probably you mentioned that, or you talked about the role of Supreme Court in centralizing power in the country.
No, I think this is not, the court has not exercised anything that contributes to centralization. Their judgments are contributing to the political dynamics, but they are not necessarily helping the government or the political elite's tendencies to centralize.
Okay,
They are being
thank you.
absolutely ruthless, sometimes even on themselves.
Right. My last question or final question for the session about the role of international community, especially the Western powers, in trying to resolve especially the conflict, because that's really what defines, Iraq generally between Erbil and Baghdad. There is, an Iraq fatigue in Washington, in the Western capitals, but what are the risks of disregarding or ignoring the current problems that exist in the country?
Well, the international coalition, international partners, especially the United States, I don't think one can say they've given up. The word you used, can't remember, but it's not distancing themselves per se. But on one hand, internally, we frustrated them by lack of progress. And on the other hand, they have other priorities globally. And I don't think the idea is that we feel they will abandon us, but we are not helping them to help us at a time when we are not a priority anymore. We have failed to build the state and engage America like two fully confident states. In Kurdistan, we did not do enough to make our partners happy in terms of all the reform programs that they encouraged, and in many ways they came forward with capacity building, with funding. So basically, the international community, we were lobbying or encouraging them to do more, to engage us in different ways and change tactics, things that didn't work in the past. But actually, nowadays, very few people blame them for the level of frustration they're expressing, because we have also not done enough at home to help them. I continue to say that our region as Kurdistan region and Iraq as a country are far too important for the United States to simply shelve or give, downgraded in priority. I think Kurdistan continues to have the potential to be the best partner of the United States and Europe in Baghdad and in Erbil. It could be a partner on security, on politics, on economy, on trade, and also preventing terrorism and migration. Kurdistan still has, despite its problems, the potential to be the best partner the United States can have in the region, in the whole of the Middle East, at least in the Levant area. That obviously, the fact that Kurdistan and the Kurds went through a tough period, we were never in charge of a state. We had to learn from our mistakes to build states. In fact, our leaders used to destroy states before they started building one themselves. So for us to become the partners that America deserves, they need to be investing more, engaging more, and accepting our reality and the dynamics. And the bottom-up approach by helping institutions grow and function better might be one way, making the federalism work, making Erbil Suleimaniya work better, putting more pressure on the politicians to actually focus on the right thing, including Peshmerga unity, including financial system, fighting corruption, and being more transparent. We need America to do that, but we shouldn't expect America to do it for us. It has to be done by our own leaders. America can advise, can support, and they have done enough to show their track record, to show that they've earned that respect, even if elsewhere in Iraq they are not liked. But we do see that. And what is clear is that in Kurdistan, people are still pro-Western, secular. They want that relationship to work, and they are enjoying relations that lead to democracy and freedom of expression, even though even inside Kurdistan, this authoritarian tendency is growing. So we both need each other enough to say this relationship needs to survive and last and get stronger. And I'm glad that many of our friends in America see it that way. But they need to also understand Baghdad cannot be handled the way that America handled it over the decades, the way it handled it even between 2003 and say 2014. And they cannot handle it even the way they did it 5 years ago. Iraq is new. Iraq is evolving fast. So I think one needs to revise the approach that America has in Baghdad. Baghdad needs to approach Baghdad differently. America still has its eyes fixed on Iran, and very often everything it does, including capacity building or including, say, some of the encouragement, they encourage relationship with Iraq on economy, on oil, on gas. Very often people interpret and say, actually, they want stronger Iraq so that we can face Iran. I think we should make sure that the United States communicates its policies better and less in the context of Iran, more for what Iraq is for, and make sure that Kurdistan also does not feel abandoned. And with our own fragilities, it's easy for us to descend into chaos when it doesn't help America. Stabilization and consolidation is critical. So basically, America is doing what is best for America. But at the end of the day, if Iraq is stable and Kurdistan is confident, it is good for America. And we should accept Iraq's new reality, its relationship with Iran and with Turkey, with the Gulf. Things are likely to change, and America needs to be a factor of change towards the better. Because of time, I don't want to be more specific than that, but I think it is a relationship that must work, should work, can work. And I've used to say, you need to make us the partner you deserve. But we need to also face our own leaders to say, we need to earn that. We need to do what it takes to make America proud of this relationship, and with what makes the Americans proud of this relationship. I do not believe we've done enough. But remember where we are. We are in infancy in terms of evolution as people building a state, people building a nation. We're just about to come out of our own conflicts, internal or external. We are surrounded by very tough neighbors. We're surrounded by threats. So having survived is a great achievement. Having made mistakes, it's expected. We need to really have a more optimistic view of the long-term relationship between both Kurdistan and America and Iraq and America. It has to work. It's in everyone's interest.
Thank you, Professor Dlawer, for offering your insights. I hope that some of your ideas and also solutions that you presented will find their trackers in the policy world. And thanks again for joining us this evening, and thanks for everyone who joined us from wherever they are. And I wish you a happy night and day if you are on this side of the world. Thank you.
Thank you and your team and the audience, and I'm grateful for everyone who is tuning in. All the best.